let's start. Let's start then from, let me start from org stuff and what changed, and then we'll move to the discussions. So let me share my screen. I was already announcing it in the chat, in the Slack channel, but just in case. So we changed a little bit the way how we propose topics for this meeting. So before we had all the meeting notes in our wiki, and yeah, you can see all these pages, but now just to simplify everything and to make it possible for anybody to submit a topic, I will be creating issues for each meeting, and anybody can submit topics here in format of topic, then ideally pull request if you have, and time that you need. We have speaker name as well, but I think it will be unnecessary if it's like usually it will be just the author of the comment. And I will post all the notes in all the notes in the topic. So yeah, that's some small changes that we have. Then let's move probably to topics, and we have Alex Gorkun here, so maybe you can start. I'll stop sharing my screen. We don't hear you if you are speaking.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear. I don't know if it's loud enough, but I can hear something.
Let me see if I can adjust my volume.
I think it's fine if you will just speak loud enough. It should be okay.
And I don't think I can adjust it anyway. Okay, so I wanted to talk about remote code invoker once again. I have updated the document quite a bit. My goal was to provide more examples to further my points and to try to structure the document a bit better so it's more obvious that it basically consists of two parts. One is just description, abstract description of a mechanism that will be used for intercommunications between modules. It's just functional requirements and APIs and SPI. And it doesn't suggest a certain implementation. And the other part is actually describing some implementations options that we have. So here's a little explanation about this. So first thing I wanted to point out that maybe was not so clear is that no matter the implementation, we still need certain mechanism to handle our communications, like so they would look like this, and so they wouldn't look like this. So we wouldn't have to like set headers manually to take care of retries mechanism manually every time. Like we still need an entity, an invoker, whether the implementation is based on RESTful API or whatever. And the first part of the document describes just that. This is what I think a proxy service would look like with Invoker. So we just specify a node ID that we're going to contact, services name and method and arguments that we want to pass. We get a promise. That's about it. I think even these proxy services can be generated automatically, but I haven't touched that topic. I think they can be written manually for now. So here I describe how writing a proxy model will look like. So we create this class and implementation of service interface. In DI.XML, we specify as preference, since a node that wouldn't have this module's implementation would just have a module proxy, then it wouldn't have the default preference, and we will specify it here. So when we're looking for service interface, we will get service proxy.
So let's maybe stop on the proposed interface first. So I agree that we will need some way of some kind of framework that will help us to make calls to other services, right? But on the interface, you still propose to invoke certain PHP methods. You just want to make them remote, right? And another way is to still to just have web API that we have, but to implement a framework that will help us to invoke them or to call them in the easier way, right? So you mentioned that we don't want to have to set headers in every time and so on. We want simpler ways. So I would agree with this part, but like calling PHP methods is a different part for me, which I think more questionable. And this is what we were discussing.
Well, see, we will always know PHP class and PHP method since we're writing the implementation right here. So the class is the interface we're implementing, and the method name is the method we're implementing. Like if we were writing a microservices application from the start, we wouldn't have this information. So we just use a URL here. But since we already having this information, I don't see the point to state a URL right here. So in the implementation, it can use a URL. It can use a RESTful Web API URL that will be found through configs. But I think the interface, Invoker interface, should just require class and methods. Because really that's what we want to do. We want to call a certain class and this method. And we already know the signature of it because it will be this interface we will have in every node. We will have module, like module name API modules in every node that we have. I don't see the point to state a URL here.
But the URL will be, so like if you, it will be more coupled with the implementation with the notion, like if you use REST, you can theoretically use any technology behind of it. If you use, I don't say that we are moving somewhere from PHP, but still if you want to invoke a specific class with a method, it will be more coupled.
We'll see, again, we will always have this interface. Like we have to have it because we'll have a proxy as an implementation of that interface. Even if we choose to create this microservice with different language, the way Anton described this services, we'll always have like module name, API module that will contain these interfaces. So we need URL anyway.
Okay.
So, so and this is how the local service will look like. It will just use this service without knowing whether it's actually remote or not, just regular way. Right. So I already explained why we can just write proxy methods differently all the time while we need an abstraction. So then
So there, like on this part, I have a question. I think we should not handle retries in application. It should be responsibility of the service mesh, and like as I understand, things like service registration, service location and routing, retries, load balancing. We should not handle this in Magento. It will be done by the service mesh.
See, do you have like another design document describing that service mesh? Because
I don't think it was in the design doc, in any existing design document. Yes, it is,
we don't need to describe the design of service mesh, because the design of service mesh is the responsibility of service mesh implementation. We just have to mention that we'll use service mesh for communication.
Again, this part of the Invoker description, it's an abstract one, and a service mesh can be used underneath. Like these functional requirements, they apply. Whatever you're using. Personally, what I've read about service meshes, they are required when we have the need to write different services with different languages or at least frameworks. But from my understanding, we will always have Magento. So I don't see the point. Another thing is that service mesh, like you said, should handle load balancing, but I think like our cloud solutions will have that.
No, it's more complicated. When we deploy services, we don't want service know about other services, because some services will fail, new services will be added instead. Services should not know about other services, so there should be a way for a service to register itself, and like something should track IP addresses and ports for the services, and also like load balancing and tries also.
And there was no any mention anywhere that every service will be implemented with Magento. So there could be different services.
I think so. From my understanding, in your document, you describe that services will be registered in Magento by having module API in the modules list.
Yeah, module API is just a PHP way of communicating the API of a service in other service, but the implementation of that service can be running in any different can be implemented differently in different language with different API. So the important thing here is that we need to decide what the transport, the communication layer underneath should be. So the module, for example, when module checkout wants to talk to catalog to get list of products, from the beginning of the design of service contracts that works today in Magento, that was accepted in its current design, it says that module checkout should have an API of module catalog installed, and so it has this API, it has signatures, it understands the types. So the decision was made like 4 years ago to make it the interfaces explicit and represent them as PHP interfaces. What the underlying implementation of the communication? It might be REST, it might be not REST implementation, but it doesn't matter that much for how that API is implemented on the service itself. It can be different language. The important thing is that it's represented for Magento services that want to consume that service. It's represented as API module with a PHP API interfaces.
Okay, I think it furthers my point about not having to use URL here. Like we're registering services by making interfaces and methods. So I think it's enough. I understand your point. As I've said, these functional requirements and this part of the document can be applied to a service mesh, RESTful Web API, whatever.
What do you mean applied to service mesh?
This is functional requirements of how communications between services should be handled. What functional requirement does it have? Like it can be applied like service mesh has to have unique IDs for calls to track them. Like it has to have rise mechanism.
It's fairly clear that we probably need to split. We need two separate documents. One, so let's just think about the topic, or the problem we are trying to solve here, right? The problem is bigger than Invoker. The problem with this document is that it's called Invoker, but its scope is bigger. It's trying to solve part of communication, not full communication, the problem of communication between services. So it touches some of it. That's why there is so much discussion about it. So I think so let's just split the problem. So the first we have service isolation design, right? So we decided conceptually that we want to isolate services. Now there is a sub problem to that: communication between services. So we need a general document for communication between services that describes how services are talking to each other. So parts of that, and in that communication, we have to talk about things like what protocol do we use for communication? Do we use service mesh or don't we we do not use service mesh? If we don't use service mesh, where do we put the logic of the retries, circuit breaking, timeouts, and stuff like that? And one more part of that document is the how service A invokes a service of service B, whether it's using REST URL, whether it's using API module. So we have to remember that for today, by default, the accepted approach is API module. That is how service contracts are designed. We can change it now, but we have default solution to that. So my point is that let's here focus on the Invoker side, and let's even approve this document and then maybe change it later. But more discussion is required, and higher discussion and more structured description is required for overall communication. So we have service A and we have service B. How do they talk? Other questions are: we have service A and it wants to execute two requests in parallel to service B and service C. How does it do it? As part of and when we answer those questions, like, okay, so how does communication happen? Is it synchronous? Is it asynchronous? Part of that, it will allow us to reason better about how the invoker should look like, and if we need promise library, and what promise library do we need if we need one. Do we need an event loop implementation? Event loop was asynchronous web framework for our application. Because it's very wide topic, and I think we're trying to resolve it from very small side. And the more we discuss, the deeper questions we touch. Let's first touch the bigger questions and then resolve the actual implementation details. Because the design of Invoker is implementation detail of communication problem, in my opinion.
Okay, I see a point. So this part of the document is still an abstract one. It doesn't touch communications too much. So my
proposal on this document, approve it. Just move it to the service isolation folder. Make it sub. Let's keep all of those documents that relate to service communication and service isolation in one folder directory structure. There is a folder service isolation. Move it there. Let's keep it there. We might match. I don't know, Olga, if you don't mind, we might match this document. We will edit it later. But let's switch focus a bit towards bigger question of communication.
I agree, though. I think we'll need to clarify what kind of invocation we allow here, because I don't know if I think REST API covers fewer points right now than what will be possible with this invocation. Is it correct?
Yeah, REST API allows fewer, right? But Alexander touched, and I see he has two proposals today, right? And both make sense, but they only make sense if for specific designs of communication. Sounds so. The more we talk about the service isolation, the more we understand that we might want to review the communication model today, and we might want to allow more communication than REST APIs, than service contract and REST, exposing service contracts to REST API allows today, right? So we so two Alexander's proposals depend on the communication design.
Well, I don't think they are, especially the promises one. It can
Okay,
be.
so we agree that we want to break it down, right, and to move it to the services isolation folder. So it will start with the same.
And we if anyone wants to create a design on communication, you can either create it as sub-document or as a subsection of service isolation design. So that document should evolve. Don't feel free to create a pull request to edit that document itself.
Okay, so
create subfolders.
Okay, so let's agree on what documents we expect and what we are ready to merge. Because this one is pretty big, and I want to merge and approve something that we all agree to, right? So we have invoking of a service, right? How invoking of a service happens, and then services communication. I don't know, it's very related.
At least specifically a lot of so these functional requirements that Alexander described here, a lot of these functional requirements should be moved to communication document. They're not part of. They're not a question of Invoker, at least. Okay, and so you can find at least a couple topics that you want to for the documents in here in these functional requirements. Like some of those.
Do we agree that Invoker will be masking a type of communication where it's asynchronous or synchronous?
Again, it's a good question to answer. I answered part of it in the service isolation document, where I stated that we don't want to mask the type of communication. So, in the ideal world, in my opinion, all the services are decoupled in place and time. So remote communication decouples behavior from in place.
Mm-hmm.
If communication is synchronous, they are still coupled in time. So we want to have as a communication asynchronous, to have services decoupled in time. But if you have asynchronous communication and then mask it with synchronous API, you still have that coupling, because you still have dependency. So I don't think that it's a good idea to mask asynchronous communication with synchronous API. Unfortunately, almost all Magento service contracts were designed to be synchronous calls for today.
Mm-hmm. So maybe.
That's why I think we should be moving. Generally, we should be moving and should be designing for asynchronous communication, and that's why I like some of the proposals here. Especially, I think it's important. It will be important for us to introduce to work to decide what asynchronous communication we want to do, what promises libraries we want to build, and that's why, by the way, Alexander, I understand what you say that. You say that it doesn't depend on communication. I disagree. I think it depends on communication. Most probably we'll need promise design, right? But let's first discuss the overall communication, how it happens in more details, because I only touched it a couple times in our document, but it requires a lot bigger research and a lot bigger discussion. And when we have the general agreement how we do communication, only after that we go to details like promises.
Mm-hmm. So maybe let's review these documents before we merge.
Okay, so then we need the smaller documents, right, for specific topic. And I understand you say that first we need to review communication and agree on how we do communication. And
Yeah.
And promises
then,
can be reviewed or merged before that.
Yeah, you can move both promises and both promises proposal and this proposal, move them to service isolation and merge them to have those documents, mark them as this is like version one, iteration one of the design, so that people understand that this will still be discussed.
but why? Let's break it down and let's discuss with pull requests. Let's have smaller parts so that we can agree to something and merge what we agree to.
That's a good point also. I understand your point, Olga. I just want to minimize the amount of work in progress. All of our open pull requests are work in progress. And when people come in, we don't want to confuse them. We don't want to refuse pull requests because they will most probably make sense later. But let's keep them let's have something to iterate upon. So let's say that this is the first iteration. It makes sense as the first iteration. Let's merge it, and then when we have a clearer picture, clearer document, or part of service isolation document about communication, we'll come back, we'll create a pull request towards those documents of promises, and that's my proposal. But you guys decide how you want to do it.
I don't know. I would. I don't know, Alex. If you can split it into smaller parts, maybe you can do it and like keep this pull request as is. So this is the base information that we have, and then have smaller pull requests into like in the services isolation folder, something that we will be able to discuss again and merge. Maybe just work with me, Igor, and Anton, or just ask questions in the Slack channel, so we can not wait for the next meeting, but discuss as you go with this document. I don't know. I would rather keep it as an open pull request, but merge something that we agree to. It can be smaller.
It would have to be closed sometime if it's not going to be merged. I think I have a lot of examples and points here that I would not copy to smaller design documents.
Why?
They would be just declarational, I think, those smaller ones. Because they intersect with different topics, the examples I've provided.
Okay, let's discuss maybe after the meeting. I think we'll agree that we need to split and we'll need to figure out what we do with this pull request, right? Let's maybe discuss separately what we do.
Right. But my next topic promises, I don't see how it depends in any way, even on this topic.
Alex, I just wanted, okay.
It doesn't depend on this topic. It depends on communication topic.
I just wanted to ask, I don't know if you can let Jet go before you, because he'll need to leave later. You won't be able to. If you can stay.
Yeah, I was gonna say that I only got about 15 minutes now. Yeah, let me share my screen. You see that?
Yes.
Okay, let me get rid of the, okay, I don't know how to move the Zoom stuff, or the Zoom stuff out of the way. Let's see. It's getting in the way of my tabs. Okay, so.
You just.
How about that?
Move.
There we go. So yeah, this is the technical vision that I had set up. I just wanted to, before getting into it, show this header of this article here, how it feels to learn JavaScript in 2016. Still pretty relevant today. There's just a plethora of technologies to look at, and it's very difficult for people to understand which ones to choose. So I think this thing is so in the way. I can't.
You just click and hold left mouse button and move it.
There we go. Let me get that up. There we go. Okay, so yeah, there's already been people reaching out to try and figure out like how to ramp up new JavaScript projects, and you know, this is what they're faced with. They don't really know what to do. So this is more of a general document as to what technologies to use and why, and then we can kind of fork off of this idea for specific projects, because every specific project has its own architectural requirements. But I did want to point out some key components that are pretty important for front-end applications in general, like portability. I've noticed a lot of people building components in such a way that they just can't be used in any other environment than that one. And you know, just keeping in mind that we might be interested in having certain components being used in different environments, different pages, stuff like that, right? So extensibility is, of course, a huge Magento factor, you know, being able to extend a component. I think that word is a little bit abused currently in Magento, because like our current extensions don't really, in my opinion, extend anything. They more just allow you to manipulate existing things. It's violating the open close principle. So, you know, this is more of a extensibility concept that I wanted to emphasize. And maintainability has a lot of facets to it: human readability, code review, stuff like that, that we can actually make adjustments to things without being too thrashing with everything. Consistency, performance, accessibility, that's pretty important. I don't know that we focused too much on that in the past, but there's some points to hit on that one. Internationalization, productivity, and quality. So those are pretty much what I'm focusing on here with most of these decisions down here. But just to start with React, because that's a pretty popular topic right now, what kind of things is React going to bring us to the table, right? It's going to bring portability, because you can have it run in mobile environments, pretty much any environment that you want, in terms of JavaScript. And, you know, performance, it's definitely way better than some of its counterparts. Productivity, I'll hit on these points here. So without just reading this document out loud, I definitely don't think I have time for that, but, you know, let's see here.
Is it possible that you make it public? Is there anything that stops you?
Yeah, is it not already public, or oh, you mean like on a different?
Yeah, wiki is not available for everyone. It's just for Magento internal people.
Yeah, I can make this public. I already passed it off with Andrew and fixed his points. I wanted also to have Zetlin weigh in. He was planning on it, just to kind of see if we can align. I'm seeing, you know, examples of the PWA app in terms of their technology decisions as to how they affect future projects as well. So I would like to get him to weigh in on some of that before making it public, but it doesn't look like he's jumping on that. So maybe we can just make it public.
Yeah, maybe let's make it public, and then we can, I think we can find people in the community who can also look at it. As you mentioned, yeah, I think it's a really great document with a lot of references.
Yeah, it's basically just consolidating this whole thing and kind of focusing on the parts that are relevant for a modern application. Just at a very high level, we've got React, TypeScript, we've got the Adobe Spectrum components called out for a reusable component library, and just a guide on like downloading third-party packages and what to look for. Sometimes people need some guidance around that because it can be a tough decision. Let's see, there's a whole bunch of links in this document. If you've noticed, there's just hyperlinks everywhere. And I go into styles a little bit with CSS modules, which is what we're using in the sales channel client repo currently, and also how TypeScript can leverage those CSS modules. And let's see, code quality. Yeah, another thing I wanted to talk about was code climate. I don't know if we have an account or anything like that for continuous integration. Well, we do have Travis CI, but for code climate, it's more of a quality score given your code. If we were able to sign up for that, we would get better insights into what we're actually committing with our code, and if we're actually hurting things with complexity, or if we're making things better over time. It'd give us more visibility into that. I think that would be ideal. But let's see, at a very high level though, I wanted to see the React component library browser support wasn't too big of a deal. There was one thing that came out with browser support, which is polyfill.io, and that's a really cool technology that allows us to basically get the best of both worlds. Like, we don't want to incur a performance hit on people who have modern browsers, right? We want to give them the best experience without downloading all this extra crap that they don't need. So polyfill.io allows us to do that, while at the same time having outdated browsers download only the things that they need and nothing more. And the way that they do that is with browser testing, so that they can actually do a server-side, I shouldn't say that, so they can actually just pull down only the scripts needed. They know what browser you're using, and they deliver exactly what you need. So they're using Browser Stack to do various tests and to make sure that certain features are working. They have a whole test suite against it to make sure that those features are available for each browser, and then that's how they're determining which scripts to give you. So I thought that was pretty great. Let's see, business. Yeah, so does anyone have any specific questions about any of these high-level topics I can dive into a little bit more? Or concerns? React, TypeScript, Adobe Spectrum. Do you want to hear more about Adobe Spectrum? There's some stuff to say.
Actually, I have a question regarding performance testing. Do you have any documentation about this?
No, I didn't hit on that at all. Performance testing, no.
Okay, I think we need to add it.
I can add a section, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so I can add that, but it's not in this document currently. Let me add a comment there. Now, are you talking about performance testing at a like a unit test level, or something else specific?
Actually, it's average. For example, for a component, we need, I do like unit or integration performance testing. But from Magento theme at all, we need to test, I believe, all process. So how
right.
it rewards the browser, how every action is performant like this. And
right,
I
so
believe we need to see how to easiest integrate some measurement and metrics in our framework to easy test performance.
So fortunately, Jest already provides that out of the box. If you're talking about like complexity and render performance, stuff like that, you're going to be able to do some Jest snapshot rendering with shallow rendering, and also you can go a step further and do some regression tests and whatnot. But Jest will tell you if certain tests are running slowly. So as long as we focus on more of a full coverage strategy, we'll be able to see that in our test reports. It'll show up red. It'll be like, this is taking too long. So we kind of get that for free in some ways. But if we're looking for something more third party to plug in that'll give us better insights into performance, I can do a little bit more research there.
Actually, one thing I expect that we need to track performance results on a daily basis in some CI/CD process. So
like make sure that future code isn't making performance worse. You mean something like that?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that's another thing that I think Code Climate's going to give us is mostly it's about complexity, right? Like if the complexity gets worse over time, we'll know about it. So I think that's an important point to hit on with code quality. Maybe I can add a few more blurbs of text about that, but I'll also do a little bit more of a dive into performance testing, see if there's something third party we can plug in that'll make that more obvious from even without using Code Climate, just from a purely testing standpoint.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, okay, I'll add that.
I have another related to this topic of performance. These
Yeah.
components they will use like our web APIs and contain business logic. They're not just visually.
Right. Yeah. So this is it's a front end tech vision. It's nothing about the back end. So in terms of APIs, I think I briefly touched on that, but I didn't dive into it too much.
Oh,
You know,
what
this
I'm talking about, we have to test not only performance of like rendering elements, but whether our web APIs are used efficiently.
are used efficiently.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that a bit? What are some
Whether a
inefficient
component
API features that you've seen?
makes too many requests unnecessary, like too many GraphQL requests, or
Right. Yeah.
business logic should be tested as well, not just rendering. That's what
Well, yeah, I did hit on business logic. So I was actually fighting for a business logic repository that's separate from any individual project, so that we could reuse that business logic across projects. You know, we can put as much as we can in API services layer. That would be ideal. But also having a business logic repository that's written exclusively in TypeScript, 100% test coverage. You know, just being able to have that as a separate business logic layer, I think would be a good way to test those things in isolation without the components that use them specifically, right? Does that satisfy your?
Well, still, if those business logic repositories, there would be just wrappers around web API calls, right?
Actually, no. No, it wouldn't, because the business logic repository wouldn't theoretically wouldn't be doing any API calls at all. That would be more the responsibility of, in the case of React, it would be the responsibility of like Redux actions. So yeah, we test Redux actions. Basically, each action has like a single request, maybe at maximum, but having multiple requests, that would just be calling the same action multiple times. So it probably gets into complexity again a little bit, but yeah, I don't know to what extent we would be able to test for that. I'd have to give that some more thought.
Because even like we use actions, a component may use actions inefficiently again, like calling too many actions. I don't know.
I'll write that in this comment here. Do components overuse actions and / API calls? So I'll do some more research there. Yeah.
Okay, let's maybe wrap up this topic, and you publish this document. People can add as a pull request to our repo, and people can add more questions probably.
Oh, when you say public, you mean to the architects repo?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. And then maybe move to the next Alex topic. So we have just 15 minutes left.
Yeah, I got to step out for the front-end guild preparation. See y'all. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So promises. Again, this document describes an API and a bit of implementation, but these promises I'm talking about, they don't rely on how we're going to implement communications with services or anything like that. It's just web API for any asynchronous operations. I think if everyone's okay with it, it can be merged now without further discussions about distributed Magento. So, okay, my reasoning behind introducing these standard promises is, like Anton said, our future service contracts will most likely be asynchronous, and we need to think about using standard promises. So requirements. I think that promises should not support forwarding because it may look confusing. I describe it here. If you can read about that. So the API of promise will have a then method that accepts a callback. It will receive a single argument, the result of execution. otherwise method is another method which will receive callbacks and will be those callbacks will be executed only when there is an exception that occurred during the synchronous operation. Those callbacks will receive only a single argument, an instance of throwable. The most important thing about this standard is that promises can be used in a synchronous way as well as asynchronous. This is required to prevent bubbling of having to use asynchronous operations. I've done an explanation about this. Basically, when you write one method that uses a promise and there is no way to wait for it, then you have to return another promise, and it just snowballs all the way. So you need to have a way to wait for a promise explicitly at some point to actually be able to return a value, not just another promise. So actually in Ghazal promises, wait method unwraps a promise, so it returns values that would be given to then callback and throws an exception that would be given to otherwise. I propose we do not do that. Wait method just waits for a promise to finish. It doesn't return anything. It doesn't throw an exception if something went wrong. So you would have only a single way to get the result and get exceptions. To avoid confusion is to set callbacks for them and otherwise. So we would have a default callback for otherwise methods. So if an exception occurs, it would be just rethrown if no explicit otherwise callback is provided. So API. I think API should be divided to two interfaces. One is for basic interface that will have then otherwise and wait. This interface is for client code to use. Like when a method returns a promise, this is what client code will be using. A way to provide callback for positive result, for an exception, and to wait for a promise. If a callback is already provided, an exception will be thrown, again, to avoid confusion. And another interface is for a code to create promises. It extends the previous interface and it provides to method to resolve with a value that will be given to then callback and to reject a promise with an exception that will be given to otherwise callback. Implementation. I think our promises should be wrappers around Ghazal promises. It's a well-known library. It provides a way to use the promises synchronously if you want to. It provides the wait method. It has other stuff like forwarding and other tools, but we don't really need them. Why I want to use this library in particular, because it provides a way to use promises synchronously, and it is a well-known and mature library. I think it will just work fine, and indirectly we are already using it in Magento. I also looked into React PHP. This vendor usually provides some libraries regarding asynchronous operations. Their implementation for promises is based on promises A standard, which does not provide a synchronous way to use these promises. So it doesn't fit our needs. Also, Ghazal promises are used in Amazon SDK. I don't know, I was just Googling whether someone has any problems with Ghazal promises. I don't think it's a common thing. I guess that's it.
Can you add links to the document? So first add link to the Ghazal promises, just so people don't Google, but go directly to that link, and Then about React PHP, just to add a note that you considered it and like why you didn't choose it. So we have it in the history.
Okay. Oh, another point I wanted to hit is Anton said like we may have event-based implementation of the networking between services. Sending a request, immediately getting a response that it's accepted, and then waiting for like a service that we called to call us back. I think these promises can be used with that approach just fine, that they would be resolved when we do receive that callback. For simplicity's sake, I think these promises should be used as response types for asynchronous services, no matter how they actually communicating with each other, because again, they provide both ways to consume them, synchronous, asynchronous, whatever you want. Oh, and another thing I forgot to write here, it was pointed out to me in the app design topic that it will be good to have a utility just to unwrap these promises with the simple way, like having a class that provides a default then, default otherwise, then calls wait, and then actually returns the value that is the result and throws an exception if there was one. Like for simplicity for third-party developers to use. So if they don't want to make their code asynchronous, they can just use that utility. Like when they receive a promise, they call unwrap, and it just returns the value and throws an exception. I think it will be useful.
So, what are the benefits of making asynchronous operations synchronous? Where would we use this promise?
Not sure. Like services would service contracts would return them. That's my first thought, but I thought that any asynchronous operation can return them. Again, they can be used both asynchronously and synchronously. And I think it's crucial to provide a way to use them synchronously as well. Because if you, again, I explain this here, if you don't have a way to wait for a promise, then you can't return a value like from a method.
But this is a benefit of asynchronous operations, that you don't need to wait for the result. You can just send the request and move on. You don't need the result. I'm just trying to like understand why do we want to change this and where we would use it.
Example, I write this like one call service B process. There could be like 10 calls asynchronous. We make them asynchronously. But then we want to return a certain value that depends on all these processes to be finished. So we run 10 processes asynchronously, but then we wait for them and we return a certain value.
So I guess like why you're asking about that, Igor, is we can use it, for example, for a transition period when we will still have synchronous interfaces. If you have asynchronous interface in the API, yes, you may not wait, and you will use promise for async operation. And you do not wait, you return, for example, ID of the operation or whatever. But for example, we might have a transition period when we will be still using those operations synchronously. Or like, as I understand, it's just a feature which is provided by this implementation, by the interface, but you can
that
use.
Is true. That was my main concern. But again, this is required not only in this intermediate process, but we always have some point when we have to have a certain value.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the functionality. I'm just trying to see where we would use it for which operation. And if we have multiple operations, do we need to handle distributed transaction? And if yes, then how it would handle distributed transaction? I mean, it makes sense in isolation, but what is the real use case for this right now?
Actually,
transactions as a whole other point. I don't see how.
yeah.
But if we're performing these operations, then are you saying that these operations should not be wrapped in the transaction? Only in this case it would work. And this is limitation, or what does it mean?
Actually, in our technical vision, we have statements that all of our services should be asynchronous. Yeah. So, but we cannot do it immediately because all our code currently is synchronous, and we can make interface that looks like asynchronous but work synchronous way. And promise interfaces is built for this. So you don't know if actually the code is synchronous or asynchronous. You use promise, and if you create your IP in this way that it returns promise, you can switch in future from synchronous to asynchronous API.
I understand this. On the other hand, masking the type of communication is anti-pattern. You should be able to know whether it's operation synchronous or asynchronous, but this might be a small concern. But I'm just still trying to understand which operations like we would make synchronous and would want to keep it. Which operations we would make asynchronous and would want to make synchronous like temporarily?
Actually, all of our APIs should be asynchronous. And when you use it asynchronous operation in synchronous code, you need to somehow adopt it. And this is why we introduce method like wait.
So would you make a place in order also asynchronous?
All the errand, actually.
Again, you can call wait on an asynchronous operation. Doesn't make it synchronous. It just waits for it to finish if you need to wait for it.
Okay, let's. I need to run to another meeting, and we are running out of time. Can you discuss maybe with Igor and add more, like more use cases, more specific use cases? And I don't know, I didn't hear any other concerns about this document. Anton mentioned there that you need to look at other libraries, but you already explained that. So I don't know if nobody else will be adding more comments. Can you just sync with Igor on what can be added to the document to make it more clear? And probably we can move on with it unless somebody else adds more questions.
I have one small comment. It's why wait method don't return result, just wait.
Don't like it?
Yeah, I don't like it. I expect that wait method will return.
It's to avoid confusion. Let's say you have provided a then callback. You have received the result there. You done something. But then wait also returns the result, which you may have already been processed.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Can you please add it to the document as well? So that's good that we discussed it, but hopefully we will not be asking the same question again.
No.
Okay, then let's wrap up the meeting. Thank you all. And Alex, please update the document, sync with Igor to add more to it. And I think, and then ping our channel in Slack. And I think you'll be able to proceed with it. Okay, thank you all and see you next time.
Mm-hmm.